Let me ask you a question right at the beginning. Have you ever poured your own capital, your own expertise, and your own blood into saving an empire, only to have the heirs of that empire look you in the eye and call you a parasite? Let me know where you are watching from in the comments, because the story I am about to tell you is a masterclass in the lethal consequences of underestimating a quiet woman with a structured legal defense. My name is Evelyn Cross, I am 58 years old, and for the last 30 years, I have been one of the most ruthless corporate restructuring experts in Manhattan. 3 weeks ago, I buried my husband Robert at a private secured memorial service in the Hamptons. 300 people attended, they filled every row of the vaulted chapel. Robert was that kind of man, the kind a whole industry shows us up for. After the service, his daughter Paige walked up to me in the receiving line. She bypassed the standard condolences, leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive, aggressive perfume, and in front of 60 high net worth mourners, in a voice that carried across the entire marble foyer, she delivered her ultimatum. You have 30 days to vacate the CEO suite, gold digger. We are selling the company. I said nothing and did not flinch. I held her gaze with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator calculating distance. Then I turned, walked to my chauffeured car, and drove back to the city. But here is what Paige didn't know, what none of them knew. 4 years before he died, Robert had done something extraordinary. Something so precise, so legally devastating, that it could only have come from a man who loved and planned with absolute corporate ruthlessness. And 30 days after that funeral, 3 strangers arrived at the executive boardroom of the company headquarters. They weren't carrying moving boxes for me. They were carrying briefcases filled with financial ruin for her. Welcome back to the channel where we explore the power of female empowerment, silent strategy, and delayed justice. If you are new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because Evelyn's story is a masterclass in letting your enemies dig their own graves. I should tell you about that funeral, because what Paige did was not a whisper of grief. It was a hostile takeover declaration. It was a bleak Tuesday in November, the kind of New York afternoon where the sky looks like shattered slate. The memorial was held at a private estate. Robert Sterling, 72 years old, founder and nominal CEO of Sterling Global Logistics, a massive international supply chain empire. 300 attendees, I counted, because noticing the metrics of a room is an occupational habit that I have never been able to turn off, and sat in the front row left side. I wore a tailored black Tom Ford suit, my hands were folded in my lap. I had managed the PR crisis of my husband's sudden passing, handled the board of directors, and stabilized the stock price, all before putting on my black blazer. Paige and her brother Derek arrived 20 minutes late. They did not sit with me, and sat across the aisle, flanked by their own aggressive corporate counsel, like a phalanx of mercenaries. During the eulogy, the speaker talked about Robert's visionary leadership, his unyielding determination, and how he built an empire from nothing. I felt Paige's stare during those words. She wasn't looking at the speaker, she was looking at me. And her expression wasn't grief, it was a cold, calculating inventory of assets after the service. The receiving line formed in the main hall. I shook hands. I accepted the calculated condolences of rival CEOs and venture capitalists. Then, Paige stepped in front of me. She didn't wait for the line to thin out. She stepped right into my personal space. Her eyes flat and vicious. You have 30 days to vacate the CEO suite, gold digger, she hissed, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the room. We are selling the company. Don't bother taking the corporate jet home. She delivered the line, the way an arrogant junior executive terminates an intern. Flat, final, rehearsed. Derek stood 2 steps behind her. He didn't say a word, but he nodded once. A slow, deliberate tilt of the chin that confirmed his absolute complicity. Half the room heard her clearly, I know, because the silence that immediately rippled outward was deafening. One of the attendees was Marcus Thorne, a ruthless hedge fund manager who had been trying to acquire Sterling Global for a decade. He watched the exchange with a small, hungry smile. I didn't cry, I didn't defend my honor, I simply looked at Paige, memorized the exact angle of her arrogance, and walked out. 30 days, she had given me 30 days. I didn't know it then, but that specific time frame was going to matter more than either of us ever anticipated. Not because 30 days was enough time to pack up an executive office, but because 30 days was how long it took for three strangers to assemble the unassailable truth and detonate it in her face. Let me take you back 10 years, because you need to understand what that company actually was before you can understand what happened inside that boardroom. I am a corporate restructuring expert. I specialize in distressed assets, hostile takeovers, and saving multi-million-dollar companies from the brink of total annihilation. My job is to walk into burning buildings, fire the people holding the matches, and rebuild the foundation with cold, hard capital. In the spring of 2014, I was hired by the board of directors of Sterling Global Logistics. The company was hemorrhaging money. Robert had built a brilliant network, but his first wife's devastating, prolonged illness had derailed his focus. After she passed, Robert stopped maintaining the company. He was drowning in toxic debt, outdated infrastructure, and aggressive competitors circling like vultures. Robert met me in the executive boardroom. He looked exhausted, a man wearing a suit that suddenly felt 3 sizes too big. "The board thinks we're dead in the water, Evelyn," he said, staring out the window at the Manhattan skyline. "Are they right?" I spent the next 3 weeks conducting a brutal forensic audit of the entire global operation. I reviewed thousands of contracts, supply chain logistics, and offshore accounts. Underneath the crushing debt and the catastrophic mismanagement, I saw the bones of an absolute juggernaut. I didn't just consult, I invested. I liquidated a massive portion of my own private equity portfolio. I injected $5 million of my own personal capital into Sterling Global. I spent 2 years restructuring the debt, firing incompetent executives, modernizing the entire logistical grid, and crushing our competitors. Robert and I were professional adversaries for 6 months, strategic partners for another year, and married by the following spring, and was 48, he was 62. I want to be clear about what my $5 million and my relentless expertise bought. When I arrived, Sterling Global was valued at a toxic negative $30 million, facing imminent liquidation. By the time I finished my restructuring, the company was valued at $450 million. I saved his legacy and rebuilt his empire. Robert knew it. 2 years after we married, he named me the chief operating officer and transferred a massive block of shares into my name. But corporate shares, as I would soon be violently reminded, are only one piece of a much larger, much darker puzzle that Robert had been assembling in the shadows, and want to be fair to Paige, but I have no desire to be kind. Cruelty in the corporate world is a currency, and Paige had been hoarding it for years. Paige and Derek were Robert's children from his first marriage. Paige was 32, managing a boutique PR firm that survived on her father's connections. Derek was 38, a managing director at a mid-tier investment bank who drove a Ferrari he couldn't actually afford. After their mother died, they retreated into their own entitlement. They rarely visited their father, except when they needed an infusion of capital to fund their luxury lifestyles. When they finally realized I was a permanent fixture in Robert's life, they did not see a savior who had rescued their inheritance. They saw a threat to their unearned wealth. There was a moment, just one, when I saw the absolute depth of Paige's delusion. She stood in my newly modernized executive suite, looking at the multi-million-dollar logistical command center I had built. "Dad's money really bought you a nice playground, Evelyn," she sneered, running a manicured finger over my glass desk. "I bought this playground, Paige," I replied calmly, not looking up from my terminal. "Your father's money was gone 3 years before I met him." She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Keep telling yourself that. If Paige was the aggressive frontal assault, Derek was the silent, toxic decay in the foundation. He visited his father 3 or 4 times a year, always alone, always leaving Robert looking exhausted and defeated. 3 years before Robert died, I intercepted a secure wire transfer confirmation on the corporate ledger. It was a transfer of $250,000 from a discretionary corporate holding account to an offshore LLC registered in Derek's name. The notation read, "Emergency liquidity loan." Over the next 14 months, I tracked 3 more transfers. 400,000, then 300,000, totaling nearly $1 million leveraged against the company's operating capital. I approached Robert in his private study. I laid the forensic printouts on his desk. "Robert, Derek is siphoning corporate capital. This is a massive compliance violation." Robert rubbed his eyes, looking suddenly very old. "I know, Evelyn, he's in trouble, bad investments, I'm handling it. Please let me handle my son." I am an auditor. I noticed the structural details of a lie and trusted Robert to handle it. But I encrypted the ledgers and locked them in my personal vault. I wouldn't learn what Derek was actually doing with that $1 million until day 30. And by then, his own wife would be learning it alongside him, with devastating consequences. The corporate warfare started 4 days after the funeral. Paige didn't just whisper, she utilized her PR firm to launch a coordinated, brutal smear campaign across the financial sector. Blind items appeared in the Wall Street Journal, implying that a grieving tech titan had been manipulated by a ruthless corporate mercenary who had isolated him from his children during his final months. The effects were immediate. The board of directors began panicking. 3 major international clients threatened to pause their contracts due to the instability in leadership. The stock price took a sharp, alarming dip. I didn't respond to the press. I didn't issue defensive statements. I stayed in my corner office, maintaining absolute operational control, reviewing the quarterly earnings reports with the steady, cold focus of a sniper ignoring the wind, and was not going to fight Paige's PR war. I had something she didn't have, the absolute truth. I just didn't know yet how spectacularly Robert had weaponized it on my behalf. Day 8, the first physical strike. I arrived at the Sterling Global headquarters at 6:00 a.m. my standard operating time. My encrypted executive keycard flashed red at the private elevator bank. Access denied. I stood in the marble lobby of the empire I had literally funded, looking at a digital lock that refused to recognize my authority. The head of corporate security, a man whose salary I personally authorized, approached me looking uncomfortable. Cross, I'm sorry," he stammered, avoiding my eyes. "The board issued a directive at midnight. Paige Ingram presented them with an emergency injunction. Your access has been temporarily suspended pending a full review of the estate." He handed me a legal document. It was drafted by Paige's aggressive legal team. It stated that Robert's last will and testament, drafted 15 years prior, bequeathed the controlling shares of Sterling Global equally to Paige and Derek. It demanded I vacate my position and surrender all corporate assets within 21 days by day 30, or face immediate public termination and civil fraud charges. My hands didn't shake. I read the document twice. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of citing a 15-year-old will to override my legally documented position as COO and equity partner was almost impressive. "I see," I said, my voice level. I handed the document back to the security chief. "Ensure my office is undisturbed. I will be auditing the security logs upon my return." I turned and walked out of the building and called my personal corporate attorney, a terrifying litigator named Arthur Bellingham. "Arthur," I said as soon as he answered, "they locked me out of the building and are citing a 15-year-old will." Arthur sighed, the sound of a man who dealt with inherited arrogance for a living. "The old will exists, Evelyn, but your equity transfers and your employment contracts supersede it. They cannot legally force you out without a massive shareholder vote." "But they can tie me up in litigation," I countered, my mind already calculating the operational damage. "They can freeze the assets and can bleed the company dry while we fight in court." "Yes," Arthur admitted quietly. "It could take 2 years to clear the injunctions. The company's valuation will tank in the meantime. 2 years, 2 years of bleeding capital, because a daughter who had never read a balance sheet decided she wanted to play CEO. I went back to my penthouse and poured myself a single glass of Macallan 25. I sat in Robert's massive leather armchair overlooking Central Park and had options. I could launch a counter-injunction and could leak the truth to the financial press and destroy Paige's reputation. Day 12, Derek arrived at my penthouse unannounced. He managed to get past the doorman by using Robert's old security codes, and walked into my living room wearing a custom Brioni suit that I knew, mathematically, he could not afford. "Evelyn," he said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I know Paige was a bit aggressive at the funeral, she's emotional, but I'm here to offer a solution." He sat on the velvet sofa, crossing his legs with unearned confidence. "We have an aggressive buyer lined up. Marcus Thorne's hedge fund wants to acquire Sterling Global for $300 million. We are willing to buy out your operational interest for $10 million right now. You sign the NDA, you walk away rich, and we avoid a massive public legal bloodbath." I looked at him. $10 million, a fraction of the $5 million I had originally invested, accounting for inflation and the massive equity I held in a company worth $450 million. "I rebuilt the supply chain infrastructure from the ground up, Derek," I said softly. "I secured the international shipping routes and saved this company." "I appreciate your administrative help, Evelyn, I really do," Derek replied, oblivious to the danger in my voice. "But let's be realistic, Dad was sick, his judgment was compromised when he gave you those shares. If we go to court, we will expose every single mistake you made. Take the 10 million, start over." I held his gaze. "Your father had the sharpest, most ruthless mind in logistics right up until the day his heart stopped." Derek stood up, smoothing his expensive tie. "I tried to help you, Evelyn, don't say I didn't." He left, I stayed in the chair, and heard the elevator doors close. Day 13, Plan B unfolded as I anticipated. Paige filed a brutal public petition in probate court, claiming Robert lacked mental capacity when he appointed me CO and transferred the equity. She cited his heart medications, hired a corrupt medical expert to testify to his cognitive decline, and demanded an immediate freeze of all corporate restructuring. Simultaneously, Derek began calling our major international suppliers. He informed them that the company was undergoing a hostile internal transition and warned them that my contracts might not be honored by the new ownership. I lost a $50 million European distribution contract within 48 hours. The client sent a panicked email citing unacceptable leadership instability. They were destroying the empire just to ensure I couldn't sit on the throne. I walked into Robert's private home office that evening. I wasn't looking for evidence, I was looking for a specific bottle of vintage scotch he kept in the lower cabinet, and opened the heavy oak door. And I saw it. I am an auditor, I noticed structural anomalies. The false backing of the oak cabinet didn't align with the internal shelving by 1/8 of an inch. My hands moved on instinct. I pressed the hidden latch, the panel clicked and swung open. Inside was a heavy, fireproof biometrics safe. I placed my thumb on the scanner. Robert had coded my biometrics into everything he owned. The safe beeped and unlocked. Inside was a sealed, heavy manila envelope. On the front, in Robert's sharp, precise handwriting, in the blue ink he always used to sign international treaties, "For Evelyn. When the vultures start circling." I carried the envelope to the massive oak desk, the same desk where I had spent countless nights redesigning the international shipping routes. The air in the office felt still, insulated from the corporate warfare raging outside its walls. I sat down, broke the heavy wax seal, and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items. The first was a thick, legally bound document printed on archival paper. At the top of the first page, in stark black font, the Sterling Global Vanguard Irrevocable Trust. Established date, 4 years ago, filed with the state of Delaware. The second item was a single sheet of Robert's personal stationery. His handwriting filled both sides. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, I am gone, and they have come for the empire. I am sorry, I hoped they wouldn't, but I knew they would. Call Arthur Bellingham immediately. I put everything into the trust 4 years ago, the holding company, the voting shares, the offshore liquidity reserves, everything that matters. You are the sole beneficiary and the absolute managing trustee. Arthur has the original documents and all supporting compliance records. I am sorry I didn't tell you. I wanted our last years to be about us, about the life we built together, not about defending our fortress from my own blood and love you." Always I read the letter 3 times, The precision of it, the absolute unassailable foresight. Robert had seen the threat coming 4 years before his heart finally gave out, and he had built an impenetrable legal bunker around the woman who saved his company. I didn't cry, I didn't cheer, I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed Arthur Bellingham. He answered on the first ring, Evelyn. His voice was heavy, lacking its usual razor-sharp professional edge. I found the envelope, Arthur, I said, my voice steady. A long exhale on the other end of the line. Good, then you know the architecture of the defense. Come to my office immediately. I have the originals. I drove to Arthur's high-security legal firm on Wall Street the next morning. His office was a massive corner suite overlooking the financial district, filled with modern art and the intimidating silence of extreme wealth. Arthur met me at the door. He looked older than I remembered, the loss of his oldest client weighing on him. He gestured for me to sit at the sprawling glass conference table, where 3 thick, black leather binders were already waiting. Let me show you the fortress Robert built for you, Arthur said quietly. He opened the first binder, the irrevocable trust. It was a masterpiece of corporate law. An irrevocable trust, Arthur explained, removes the assets from the grantor's personal estate. Once signed, it cannot be revoked, modified, or contested without the beneficiary's explicit consent. The assets inside the trust do not pass through probate. They are immune to any 15-year-old, while Page's lawyers were currently waving around. Do you know what is currently held outside the trust? Arthur asked, a dark, cynical smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Tell me, Robert's personal checking account, which holds $32,000, and a vintage 1998 Porsche 91111 that requires $60,000 in engine repairs. Arthur said, that is the entirety of the estate Page and Derek are currently fighting over. They just don't know it yet. I stared at the documents. What about Page's petition, claiming Robert lacked mental capacity when he appointed me? Arthur opened the second binder. He slid a pristine, notarized medical document across the table. 6 months before Robert executed the trust, he requested a comprehensive, multi-day cognitive and neurological evaluation from Dr. Eris Thorne, the leading neuropsychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. Robert scored flawlessly. He was categorized as possessing elite executive function. I have the certified report. Page's petition is legally suicidal. He thought of everything. I whispered, feeling the profound weight of my husband's protective genius. He loved you, Evelyn, Arthur said softly, and he understood the viciousness of his own children. He knew Page would try to leverage his illness against you. He neutralized the threat before she even formulated the plan. Arthur leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs. There is one more thing. Robert left a secondary letter. He asked me to read it aloud to the board of directors and the family when the time came, and was very specific about the audience. What does it say? It is a detailed, legally actionable documentation of Page and Derek's actions over the past 5 years, Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a grim cadence. Things they will not want read in front of witnesses. Especially not in front of the buyers they are trying to sell the company to. When, I asked, my mind instantly shifting into strategic execution mode. Whenever you are ready to drop the hammer. I sat in Arthur's office for 2 hours, memorizing the legal architecture. When I walked out onto the street, the cold Manhattan air felt sharp and clean. I wasn't the same woman who had walked in. I had walked in a corporate survivor playing defense, and walked out a sovereign ruler holding the absolute codes to the kingdom. I had options, and could call Page's aggressive legal team right now, present the trust, and end the hostile takeover before lunch. There is a trust, Page. You get a broken Porsche, go back to your PR firm, but I kept thinking about the last 15 days. The public humiliation at the funeral, the whisper in the receiving line, the locked elevator bank, the smear campaign in the financial press, the $50 million contract I had lost because Derek lied to my international distributors. They had spent 15 days attempting to publicly execute my reputation and systematically dismantle the empire I had rebuilt, and decided they deserved the full 30 days to discover that they had built their guillotine on my private property. Paige had given me 30 days to vacate the CEO suite. I decided to use every single one of those days to ensure she never set foot in the building again, and called Arthur from the back of my chauffeured car. I want to do this on day 30, inside the executive boardroom at Sterling Global headquarters. I want the entire board of directors present. Can you arrange that? I am the executor of the estate, Arthur replied smoothly. I can mandate their attendance. I want 3 external witnesses there as well, I continued, my voice cold and precise. Bring the lead auditor from our external accounting firm. Bring the chief compliance officer, and bring a federal SEC regulator, Arthur chuckled. A low, dangerous sound, an SE regulator, Evelyn. You aren't just locking the doors. You are salting the earth, exactly. Day 20, I received a panicked phone call from Nina, Derek's wife. Nina had always been the silent, profoundly anxious observer at family dinners. The kind of woman who wore expensive pearls and avoided eye contact whenever Derek raised his voice. In the 5 years I had been married to Robert, she had called me twice. Evelyn, I'm so sorry to bother you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know things are hostile right now, but I need to ask you a question. Has Derek mentioned a massive offshore liquidity crisis to you? I stopped reviewing the quarterly projections on my terminal. What do you mean, Nina? I found a hidden ledger on his personal laptop, she said, her breathing shallow and frantic. It's an offshore account in the Caymans. There are massive, continuous transfers to international sports betting syndicates and high-stakes online poker platforms. Evelyn, there is over $1 million missing from our personal accounts. I closed my eyes, the wire transfers, the 400,000, the 300,000, the emergency corporate loans Robert had covered to protect his son from federal indictment. Nina, you need to contact a forensic divorce attorney immediately, I said, my voice gentle but urgent. He told me the company was covering his investments. She cried. He told me he was going to be the new co-CEO and pay it all back. Nina, listen to me, I commanded, projecting absolute authority. The company is not covering anything. Derek is drowning. You need to protect yourself and your children before the federal authorities start asking questions. The line went dead. Nina was about to learn the brutal lesson that Paige was currently ignoring. Proximity to wealth does not equal protection from consequence. Day 25, the final piece of Paige's master plan snapped into place. She sent a formal, legally binding notification to my attorneys and the board of directors, and Derek had accepted the hostile acquisition offer from Marcus Thorne's hedge fund. $300 million for the entirety of Sterling Global Logistics. The signing ceremony would take place on day 30 in the executive boardroom. She assumed I would not attend, and assumed the threat of civil litigation, and the lock on the elevator bank had broken my resolve. She assumed I was currently packing my bags and preparing to disappear into obscurity, and had no idea that I was the one who had approved Marcus Thorne's security clearance to enter the building. Day 29, the evening before the detonation, my penthouse was silent. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The city that never sleeps, the city built on ruthless ambition and executed contracts. My encrypted phone vibrated. It was Arthur. Everything is locked into position, he said. The external auditor, the compliance officer, and the SEC regulator will meet me at the headquarters at 9:45 a.m. The board of directors has confirmed their attendance. Marcus Thorne and his legal team will arrive at 10:00 a.m. for the signing. And the letter? I asked. I have read it 3 times to ensure my delivery is flawless, Arthur replied. It is devastating, Evelyn. Good. Will Paige be expecting us? I sent her an ambiguous email confirming my attendance to finalize the operational transition. I said, a cold smile touching my lips. She thinks I am coming to surrender my keys. I hung up and poured a very small measure of Robert's vintage scotch. I raised the glass to the empty room. Watch this, Robert, I whispered. Day 30, I woke at 5:00 a.m. and did not rush. I drank my espresso, reviewed the Asian market reports, and dressed for a corporate execution, and wore a pristine white Alexander McQueen suit, a silent psychological contrast to the funeral attire I had worn 30 days prior. No excessive jewelry, just the diamond engagement ring Robert had placed on my finger, and a Cartier watch synchronized to the exact second. At 9:30 a.m., my chauffeured car pulled up to the glass and steel monolith of Sterling Global headquarters. I bypassed the front desk and used my biometric clearance at the private executive entrance, the access point Paige didn't know existed. I took the private lift to the top floor. At 9:55 a.m., Paige and Derek strode into the executive boardroom. They looked triumphant. Paige was wearing a bright red designer dress, projecting dominance. Derek looked exhausted but arrogant, clutching a leather portfolio tightly against his side. They were followed by Marcus Thorne, the aggressive hedge fund buyer, and a swarm of high-priced corporate attorneys. The board of directors sat around the massive mahogany table, looking tense and uncomfortable with the hostile transition. Paige saw me sitting at the far end of the table. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a sneer. "I'm surprised you showed up, Evelyn," Paige said loudly, ensuring Marcus Thorne and the board heard every word. "I assumed you would have vacated the premises by now, but I suppose you want to collect your final severance check in person." I said nothing and folded my hands on the polished mahogany and waited. At 10 a.m., the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Arthur Bellingham walked in, projecting the absolute authority of a man who controls billions in generational wealth. He was flanked by three individuals wearing severe anonymous gray suits. The external auditor, the compliance officer, and the SEC regulator, wearing a badge clipped to his lapel. Paige's legal team immediately stood up. "Excuse me, who authorized these people to enter a private corporate signing?" Arthur ignored them completely. He walked to the head of the table, set his heavy leather briefcase down with a resounding thud, and looked at Paige over the rim of his glasses. "I am Arthur Bellingham, executor of the estate of Robert Sterling," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute legal certainty. "We know who you are," Paige snapped, her mask a sudden sharp spike of anxiety. "But this is a private board meeting, to finalize the sale of the company. The estate is currently in probate. You have no jurisdiction here. I am not here regarding the probate of the 15-year-old will," Arthur said smoothly. He popped the latches on his briefcase. The sound echoed in the silent room like a hammer being cocked. "I am here in my capacity as the managing legal director of the Sterling Vanguard Irrevocable Trust." The temperature in the room plummeted. Marcus Thorne, a man who survived by reading the room, slowly lowered his pen. The board of directors exchanged panicked, wide-eyed glances. "What trust?" Derek demanded, his voice suddenly an octave higher. I didn't speak. I simply watched them realize that the ground beneath their feet had vanished. Arthur pulled a massive legally bound document from his briefcase and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. On October 14, 4 years ago, Robert Sterling established an irrevocable trust, transferring 100% of the voting shares, the holding company, and all offshore liquidity reserves of Sterling Global Logistics. Arthur read, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He looked at Paige. "The sole absolute and unchallengeable beneficiary of this trust is Evelyn Cross." Paige stared at the document, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at her lead attorney, who was frantically speed-reading the first page of the trust document, his face draining of all color. "That's impossible," Derek whispered, gripping the edge of the table. "Dad's will, the will governs assets outside the trust, Derek," Arthur corrected him, pulling a secondary file from his briefcase. "Those assets consist of a checking account containing $32,000 and a vintage Porsche requiring extensive mechanical repairs. That is your inheritance. This is fraud." Paige finally screamed, slamming her hands on the table, her composure shattering. He was sick, he was medicated. He didn't have the mental capacity to execute a corporate transfer of this magnitude. Arthur didn't even blink. He produced the Johns Hopkins neuropsychiatric evaluation and slid it across the table toward Paige's attorney. A comprehensive multi-day neurological evaluation conducted 6 months prior to the execution of the trust. Perfect executive function, Board certified. Your mental capacity petition is legally dead. Page. In fact, filing it bordered on forgery. Marcus Thorne stood up. He looked at Page with absolute disgust, realizing he had just spent 6 months negotiating a $300 million acquisition with a woman who owned nothing. You told me you had controlling interest, Marcus snarled at Page. I do, Page shrieked, turning to him desperately. This is a forged document. She manipulated him. There is more, Arthur interrupted, his voice slicing through the chaos. He pulled out the final document, the single sheet of Robert's personal stationery. Robert left a letter to be read into the official corporate record, in the presence of the board of directors and the federal compliance officers. Every single person in the room froze. Arthur unfolded the letter. These are his exact words, he stated, and began to read. To the board of directors and to my children, if Arthur is reading this aloud, then I am gone. And the hostile elements of my own family have attempted a corporate coup as I anticipated. Page stumbled backward, bumping into a leather chair. Page, I am aware of your attempt to force a power of attorney while I was recovering from my cardiac surgery. You attempted to seize control of the operational capital while I was intubated. Arthur blocked it on my express orders. The board members gasped audibly. Page's lead attorney slowly closed his legal pad and packed it into his briefcase. He knew radioactive toxicity when he heard it. Arthur turned to the next paragraph. He looked at Derek. Derek was sweating through his Brioni suit. Derek, over the course of 3 years, I transferred $950,000 of emergency corporate liquidity to your offshore accounts. You claimed it was for venture capital investments. I hired a forensic auditor. Every single dollar went to illegal offshore sports betting syndicates and high-stakes gambling platforms. Nina wasn't there, but she didn't need to be. The SEC regulator stepped forward, pulling a digital recorder from his pocket. Mr. Sterling, the federal agent said, looking at Derek. We will need to have a very long conversation regarding the misappropriation of corporate funds for illegal gambling. Derek collapsed into his chair. He put his head in his hands and began to sob quietly. The arrogant managing director was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal facing federal indictment. Arthur finished the letter. Evelyn did not use my money to save this company. She used $5 million of her own capital and rebuilt the infrastructure. She saved my legacy. She is the only person qualified to run this empire, and I have ensured, with absolute legal finality, that no one can ever remove her from the CEO suite. Arthur folded the letter and placed it back in his briefcase. The boardroom was perfectly, terrifyingly silent, the sound of absolute destruction. I stood up from my chair slowly. The way you stand when you are the only apex predator remaining in the room. I smoothed the lapel of my Alexander McQueen suit, adjusted my Cartier watch, and walked to the head of the table. You have 30 days to vacate my building, Page, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence. Or I will have corporate security physically remove you. You are terminated, effective immediately, from any and all consulting roles within Sterling Global Logistics. Page stared at me. The arrogance, the entitlement, the years of unearned superiority had been stripped away, leaving nothing but absolute terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to launch another insult, to threaten litigation, but nothing came out. For the first time in 30 days of threats and hostile machinations, Paige Ingram had nothing to say. Marcus Thorne didn't wait around for the conclusion. He packed his briefcase, motioned to his legal team, and stormed out of the boardroom, pausing only to glare at Paige with utter contempt. Do not ever contact my firm again, he snapped before slamming the double doors behind him. The board of directors formally recognized the trust document within 5 minutes. They voted unanimously to reinstate my full operational control as CEO, and did not apologize or need to. They understood who held the power, and they fell in line with the cold efficiency of corporate survival. Paige slowly packed her expensive designer bag. She looked at the empty boardroom, the federal agent standing over her brother, and the empire she had just spectacularly lost. The distance between what she had expected and what she had received finally closed around her like a physical blow. And then she screamed. It was not a word, it was a guttural, raw sound of absolute devastation. The sound of a woman realizing that she had brought a 15-year-old knife to a nuclear corporate war. She turned and fled the boardroom, her designer heels echoing frantically down the marble hallway. Derek didn't run, he couldn't. The SEC regulator was already reading him his rights, preparing to confiscate his encrypted devices. I didn't stay to watch the arrest. I turned to Arthur, shook his hand firmly, and walked back to my CEO suite. The security chief was already waiting at the door, holding a newly coded top-tier executive access card. "Welcome back, Miss Cross," he said respectfully. "Thank you, John," I replied. "Ensure Miss Ingram's access is permanently revoked across all global facilities." I walked into my office, sat down at my glass desk, and opened the global logistics terminal. The war was over, the restructuring was complete, it was time to get back to work. The aftermath of that 30-day siege was brutal, absolute and documented. Paige's boutique PR firm collapsed within 3 months. Without the massive retainer she had been siphoning from Sterling Global, she couldn't afford her office space or her staff. The Wall Street Journal, having realized they were manipulated by her smear campaign, published a devastating exposé detailing her fraudulent attempt to seize control of the company. She was blacklisted from the corporate sector. Derek's fall was even more spectacular. The federal investigation uncovered a massive web of wire fraud, illegal offshore gambling rings, and tax evasion. Nina filed for divorce the week the indictment came down, taking full custody of the children and the remaining non-seized assets. Derek accepted a plea deal to avoid a 20-year sentence. He is currently serving 48 months in a federal minimum security facility in Pennsylvania. I received a single letter from him last year. "I'm sorry, Dad was right." 6 words, the most honest accounting he had ever produced. As for Sterling Global Logistics, under my absolute uncontested leadership, the company expanded its operations into Southeast Asia and Europe. We acquired 2 of our biggest competitors and doubled our market capitalization. The company that Robert's children tried to sell for $300 million is now valued at over $900 million. I did not erase Robert from the corporate history and hung his portrait in the executive boardroom, right above the mahogany table where his final devastating letter was read. He built the initial network, but he also built the legal fortress that allowed me to save it, and gave me the trust, and I gave him a legacy that will outlast us all. The world of corporate restructuring is vast and unforgiving, but the underlying principles remain constant, whether you are tracking a hostile billionaire's offshore tax evasion scheme, a tech CEO's massive ego trip, or an entitled relative's desperate corporate fraud. You must follow the paper trail and must follow the digital footprint. You must trust the absolute certainty of mathematics and corporate law when you cannot trust the people standing right in front of you. My career flourished in the spectacular aftermath of that cancelled hostile acquisition. The profound clarity that came from finally severing the financial and emotional umbilical cord to Robert's toxic heirs allowed me to focus on my actual work and the true potential of the global supply chain. I spearheaded a massive international consulting initiative that helped hundreds of female executives secure their own corporate contracts and protect their equity from predatory partners and hostile boards. I was promoted, recognized, and compensated at the very highest levels of my industry. The universe has a remarkable, terrifying way of balancing its own ledgers. You just have to be patient enough and legally prepared enough to let the math work itself out. The world of corporate restructuring is vast and unforgiving, but the underlying principles remain constant whether you are tracking a hostile billionaire's offshore tax evasion scheme, a tech CEO's massive ego trip, or an entitled relative's desperate corporate fraud. You must follow the paper trail and must follow the digital footprint. You must trust the absolute certainty of mathematics and corporate law when you cannot trust the people standing right in front of you. My career flourished in the spectacular aftermath of that cancelled hostile acquisition. The profound clarity that came from finally severing the financial and emotional umbilical cord to Robert's toxic heirs allowed me to focus on my actual work and the true potential of the global supply chain. I spearheaded a massive international consulting initiative that helped hundreds of female executives secure their own corporate contracts and protect their equity from predatory partners and hostile boards. I was promoted, recognized, and compensated at the very highest levels of my industry. The universe has a remarkable, if there is one absolute lesson to be extracted from this entire corporate ledger, it is this: do not mistake a woman's silence for submission. In a world that constantly demands women to be loud, to be accommodating, to constantly explain and justify their existence, silence is the ultimate weapon. It is the space where strategy is formed. It is the vault where true corporate power is accumulated. When toxic people enter your life, they will immediately test your boundaries. They will try to make you small so they can feel large, and will attempt to exclude you from the narrative of your own life, hoping you will be too polite to point out the theft. Do not argue with them, do not scream, do not debase yourself by begging for a seat at a boardroom table you already own. Instead, become the architect of your own empire, document the disrespect, track the emotional and financial exploitation. Build your fortress quietly, deliberately, contract by contract, until your foundation is so strong that their attempts to undermine you simply shatter against the concrete. And when the time comes, when they have overplayed their hand, when they look you in the eye and tell you that you do not matter, you do not need to raise your voice. You simply present the findings and trigger the trust. You dismantle the illusion, and then you walk away in your tailored suit, leaving them to panic over the bill they can no longer afford to pay. This has been Evelyn Cross, and this is my story, a story of a hostile takeover that never happened, a $1 million theft that was documented, and a silent empire builder who refused to fund her own exclusion. Thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe, share this story with anyone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and drop a comment below sharing your own moments of quiet, devastating victory. I read every single one of them, and I celebrate your power, and will see you in the next one. Keep building your empire, keep your ledgers balanced, and never, ever let them tell you that you do not matter.